Hello everyone, my name is Zhihao. I'm here with Hassan and David to present this speech on oppose the legalizing all illicit drugs. Our presentation will begin with a historical analysis from David, who will guide us through a complex evolution of Canadian drug policy from its origin to present. His account engages a narrative of historical change in Canadian society, building on Foucault's idea to reveal the power dynamic and the social shifts that drove policy evolution. This historical context sets a stage for a deeper debate about the pros and cons for the legalization of drugs. Hassan will present the argument based on public health, social well-being, and ethical consideration, questioning the wisdom of legalizing substance that would have far-reaching consequences for individuals' health, social order, and the wider social fabric. Hassan will answer those following questions with his analysis. Who benefit from the drug legalization? How do social norms and safeguarding public health align with the push for legalization? What lesson can Canada learn from its own history and the experience of other countries? Finally, I will use Marx's theory to analyze and explain why illicit drugs will destroy the capitalism system from multiple perspectives, including the impact on the economic growth, the GDP, on the healthcare system, and the impact on the workforce and the reproduction process. As we begin our discussion, we must clearly distinguish between two concepts that often be conflated with: legalization and decriminalization. Our position is to be conscious about the blanket legalization of all illicit drugs. However, this does not mean a blanket rejection of all forms of drug policy reform. In fact, we recognize the valuable social progress achieved through decriminalization efforts and the marijuana legalization in many aspects of society. Instead, our analysis dives into a broader implication of the legalization of all illicit drugs. We are arguing for maintaining the current legal framework, including the decriminalization efforts and the legalization of marijuana. And now let's welcome David for his historical analysis.
History of drug policy in Canada. When we first think about drug policy in Canada, we must first look at the Opium Act of 1907. But before that, we must look at the background to this act. In 1879, the city of Vancouver ordered businesses to pay $500 in order to begin dealing opium. The opium industry was ruled by two dominant businesses, the first being for Caucasian pharmaceutical companies and for medical use. The other business was for Chinese factories to produce smoking opium. In the 1880s, many Chinese labor workers arrived in Canada to assist on working on the Canadian Pacific Railway, or CPR for short. With their arrival, they also brought over many cultural practices. One of these practices was the usage of smoking opium for relaxation purposes. Before they could enter the country, these workers were ordered to pay taxes. The purpose was to lessen the fear for white workers that Chinese immigrants would not take their jobs. The tax started at $15 in 1885, but by 1905, that total rose to $500. These Chinese labor workers were paid significantly less than their white coworkers and often worked the more dangerous jobs of the Canadian Pacific Railways. After the completion, many of these labor workers moved and settled in Vancouver. But for many of these Chinese immigrants, they were forced to pay a head tax and they were not allowed to have any businesses or own a home outside of Vancouver's East End, this being known now as Chinatown. And in 1907, there was the infamous race riot and labor rally. The white community of Vancouver began a labor rally against the Chinese immigrants. Many of these individuals were calling for the halt of immigration. Sorry, many of these white communities were calling for the halt of Chinese immigration as well as a deportation of these members of the community. This was because of the limited job opportunities that were available after the CPR was completed. They believed that these Chinese workers were taking all of the jobs. Many protesters joined together at the Vancouver City Hall to protest, but ended up altering their route to Chinatown and began destroying many businesses and homes of Chinese and Japanese communities. In response to this riot, Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier and Deputy Minister of Labour Mackenzie King arrived to Vancouver. During their second day in Vancouver, Mackenzie King met with many anti-opiate reformers within the Chinese community, and from there he gained valuable knowledge to the opium industry and the lucrative income it brought in, as well as the highly addictive nature of the substance. In Mackenzie King's report titled "The Need for the Suppression of Opium Traffic in Canada," he cited that the business in making opium for non-medical use was garnering an annual income between $600,000 and $650,000. In response to this new discovery, King said that the only effective way to suppress the traffic was by making the importation, the manufacture, and the sale of opium illegal, and that the only legal way to obtain opium was through medical use and purpose. This resulted in the Opium Act of 1908. The Parliament of Canada passed the Opium Act. This act, once again, prohibited the sale, the manufacture, and the importation of opium in Canada for non-medical purposes. The socio-cultural response was due to the increased tension and hate that the white majority of Vancouver had for the Chinese population. The response that the government of Canada decided to do was to favor the majority. They did this by making the sale of opium illegal, as I previously stated, since there were two main businesses in opium. The first was the white pharmaceutical companies that were using it for medical purposes, and the second was Chinese factories producing smoking opium. This resulted in favoring the white majority and leaving the minority with little to nothing. In terms of Foucault's ideology, he emphasized the construction of subjectivity by power relations and the importance of considering the impact of policies on individuals and communities. He did this by recognizing the ways policies shape identities and behaviors. Policymakers can design more effective and ethical interventions that take into account the diverse experience and perspective of those affected by the policies. And at the time, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the government of Canada only listened to the majority, and at the time, it was predominantly the white community. When they were rallying against the Chinese community in 1907, the government listened to their concerns and made the Opium Act that would greatly benefit the white pharmaceutical companies. And then shortly after the Opium Act was introduced, another act was introduced which replaced the Opium Act, and that's the Opium and Narcotic Act of 1911. This act included more powerful narcotics like cocaine and morphine as illegal drugs if it was intended for non medical use. Mackenzie King stated that police found the present legislation to not be drastic enough to allow the police the power to seize and confiscate illicit drugs. Within this new policy, they also made the possession of opium illegal as well. In doing so, it made it significantly difficult for smugglers to continue to profit off non-medical opium. It also introduced, like I stated already, the ban on cocaine and morphine for non-medical use. A significant figure within a major figure in shaping policies that would also harm racialized communities. She was also one of Canada's first woman judges. In the year 1922, Judge Murphy released a controversial book titled The Black Handle. She writes how substance use was a destabilizing and corruptive force in society, and she casts racialized members of society as a major threat to the predominantly white community of Canada. She also quotes marijuana addicts become raving maniacs and are liable to kill or indulge in any form of violence to other people. She also cites in The Black Handle how Chinatown in Vancouver was the headquarters for drug traffickers. Emily Murphy was also a advocate for making marijuana illegal in Canada, and in turn, marijuana was added to the Opium and Narcotic Drug Act without any clear reasoning as to why. Which leads us to the leads us to Narcotic Control Act of 1961. This bill was introduced on October 11th, 1961, and it was created and it was known to be one of the harshest drug laws seen in Canadian history. They gave individuals who were found guilty of trafficking drugs life sentences. The, the Narcotic Control Act, also known as the NCA, legalized harsh and disciplinary penalties to those who used drugs and were addicted, rather than helping and giving them treatment. That same year the NCA was announced, the Government of Canada also signed an international treaty, which was called the Single Convention on Drug Narcotics. Sorry, the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. This signing reaffirmed the belief that the approach to substance use and drug trafficking will be handled in a more criminal justice approach. The NCA was able to add and dismiss substances from the illicit substance list. They were able to set up meetings to address certain concerns about drugs if they deemed it was for the best interest of the public. At the time, some harmful substances that were included were opioids, heroin, cocaine, and cannabis. But for narcotics to still be used for scientific and medical purposes, there were a series of strict rules that must be followed. There was a need for licensing in order to distribute the drug these drugs, as well as a thorough record keeping of all movements of drugs. Another rule is having a permit for the importation and exportation within Canada, and that the only people who were legally allowed to carry narcotics were licensed dealers, pharmacists, practitioners, hospitals, and places that were using narcotics for scientific purposes. And in 1996, the Controlled Drugs and Substance Act was passed. It was actually first introduced in February of 1944 by the Liberal government as Bill C-7. But like I stated, it was not until 1966 when the Controlled Drugs and Substance Act was passed. This new policy gave way and replaced the at the time, Narcotic Control Act and several key components of the Food and Drug Act. That being Part 3, Controlled Drugs, and Part 4, Restricted Drugs. The CDSA, or Controlled Drugs and Substance Act, led to the regulation of importation, production, exportation, and distribution of scheduled drugs. Within this act, they also highlighted 6 common offenses to those violating it. That was possession, trafficking, cultivation, importation, and exportation. And lastly, prescription shopping. Prescription shopping was when an individual would visit multiple doctors for a high dosage of prescription narcotics. The CDSA shifted from a criminal justice approach and prioritized the treatment of addicts instead. They changed the penalties for personal drug offenses as well. They introduced a new bill to remove certain cannabis possession offenses, since cannabis was the most used drug and the most common drug possession offense. On October 17, 2018, the government of Canada legalized marijuana. This passage moved the substance from being an illicit drug under the Controlled Drugs and Substance Act to a substance that is now legal countrywide. The act aimed to accomplish 3 specific goals. The first was to keep cannabis out of the hands of youth of society. The second was preventing criminals from profiting off of cannabis. And lastly, was to protect the public's overall health and safety by allowing adults to legally access cannabis. Although cannabis was now legal countrywide, there were still rules members of society must follow if they wanted to buy cannabis. The first rule was that an individual must be of legal age, and legal age was being 18 years or older, as well as individuals can only possess up to 30 grams of cannabis. And lastly, you can only buy cannabis from legally licensed retailers. Anything purchased from not from them would be considered illegal. As well as if an individual was caught selling or giving cannabis to a person 18 years or younger, they could be potentially given a 14-year sentence for their illicit act. To highlight the Cannabis Act, there was an article published by the University of Michigan. They state that although the usage of marijuana has risen by 6% from 2007 to 2014, it came with benefits as well. Because of the popularity of marijuana, it significantly decreased the usage of harder illicit drugs by 80%. For example, the usage of heroin has been at its lowest since the 1980s and was at a 0.1% among all college and university students. And this concludes the history of drug policy in Canada.
Our argument focuses on a profound and complex issue: how illicit drugs destroy capitalism and the workforce under the capitalist system. By looking at it through Marxism, we will show the many ways this problem impacts our society. In capitalism, workers are at the heart of making goods and services, essential for business owners who want to make more money and profit. Marx argued that all profit comes from work that isn't paid for. Having the stable and well-educated labor force is fundamental for capitalism to keep growing. The illegal drug pandemic posed a direct threat to the workforce. Canadian research on 1,222 participants reported that from 2005 and 2015, 1,154 reported incidents of participants leaving the job market due to use of the illicit drugs. This not only reduced the workforce available to production, but also increased the burden on the healthcare system. In 2020, opioid use cost the Canadian healthcare system $519 million. In 2014, there were 2,108 opioid-related deaths among the school and working-age people, with an average age of death of 41 years and 275 cocaine-related deaths, with an average age of death 35 years. Those data shows the profound impact of illegal drugs on the workforce and society. Scholars at the University of Alberta estimate that victims of the opioid crisis have lost an average of 20 years in labor productivity, costing Canadians at least $4.7 billion in lost labor productivity. With the development of society and advancement of science and technology, capitalism has increased demand for educated workers. However, the impact of illegal drugs on students and schools is alarming. Research shows that students who don't use marijuana are more than twice as likely to have an A average as students who do. Additionally, college students who use prescription stimulant drugs for non-medical purposes have lower grade point average and more likely to overuse other illegal drugs. The 2022 CPSP annual report shows that illicit drugs is now the leading cause of death in 10 to 18-year-olds in Western Canada. Marx argued that capital accumulation is the core driving force of capitalist economic development. Capitalists driving economic growth by reinvesting surplus value to expand the production. GDP as an indicator of the total amount of economic activity reflects this process of capital accumulation and economic growth. However, the social cost of illegal drugs-related problems are extremely high. Take the United States as an example. In 2015, the United States expenditure on opioid crisis accumulated 2.8 of GDP. The loss of those resources not only affect the economic growth potential, but also reduce the funds available for education, infrastructure, and other public service. In his theory, Marx emphasized the importance of the social reproduction, which includes not only the production of the material goods, but also the reproduction of the labor power. That is, not only producing the workers needed today, but cultivating workers for the future. In this process, the birth and growth of the newborn is crucial because they represent the future of the society and the economy. Healthy newborn grow into healthy adults and are cornerstone of maintaining the quality and quantity of the workforce. A recent Canadian report pointed out that a self-reported opioid use rate during pregnancy was 1.4%. Drug use during the pregnancy poses significant risk to both pregnant women and babies, increasing the risk of premature birth, low birth weight infants, and stillbirths. In 2021, the number of pregnant women hospitalized for drug-related increased by 63%. The problem of illegal drugs is a complex social issue. It's not an individual problem. It touches many aspects of a capitalist system. Through the Marxist idea, we can understand this issue more deeply. Simply legalizing all illegal drugs would seriously damage the fundamental of the capitalism.
So this argument, Canadians, not drug addicts, and it asks the question, what does it mean to be a Canadian? So it's important to note that as a foundation for this argument, that drug laws work. Drug laws being introduced in uh, the early 1900s have had a very successful track record in keeping illicit drug usage rates down. While illicit drug rates, such as those for alcohol or tobacco, are very high, we see that usage rates for illicit drugs are very low. For example, in between 1992 to 1996, from a sample population of 21-year-olds, 86% were found to consume alcohol and 68% to use cigarettes, while only 13% were found to use cocaine and 11% to use hallucinogens, which is a very big difference, uh, showcasing how the drug laws are working, as in the illicit drugs are used at a much lower rate than the illicit drugs. And for a better case, we can look at Sweden as well, which presents a good example for running successful drug policy. We see that Sweden spends some of the highest amounts in Europe, over two-thirds more than the rest of the EU on drug control. And thus the reflection of this is that Sweden's drug use rates are far below the EU average. They are about approximately a third the EU average. So an interesting point to note here is that for a brief period in the 1990s, Sweden reduced spending on drug control, which saw actually an increase in the illicit drug use. However, after reinstating the drug control policy in 2002, a sharp decrease was charted. And what this kind of indicates is that A, drug laws work, they are effective, they are efficient, they have the capacity to be efficient, and B, that when drug laws are laxed, when tolerance is lessened, then the door to more usage is opened much more further. And so this is important for understanding society and morality. Uh, and this is going to be the crux of our argument here. And Durkheim argued that society is composed of mechanical solidarity as well as organic solidarity. So mechanical solidarity, referring to a shared sense of belonging or culture, and organic solidarity referring to the idea that we all work together for the survival of the organism. It sees all of society as one body, all people as components of this body who have to work together through the division of labor, through a shared sense of morality, to ensure the survival of the organism that is society. And here, the social glue, the glue that holds society together, is morality. And society itself being external to us, above us in some ways, outside of us, needing to be maintained, its morality to be maintained, which would be the job of government. And how this ties into legalization and why illicit drugs shouldn't be legalized is because drugs are, we would argue, anti-Canadian society. They do not develop a shared sense of belonging. They do not fit the mold of Canadian culture and what Canadian culture stands for. And they are not really something that can ensure the survival of the organism. And the reason for this is that drugs give society a bad name. We have to ask ourselves, what type of culture would we like to develop? Generally, trends towards illicit drugs and hard drugs cast a dark shadow over society. Research indicates that hard drugs are among the strongest indicators of a criminal career. Between 1986 and 1997, cases of child neglect driven by substance abuse has more than doubled from 1.4 million to 3 million. Furthermore, research shows that children whose parents abuse drugs or alcohol are 4 times more likely to be neglected or abused than children whose parents did not. If we look in the case of Holland in the Netherlands, where there is perhaps more tolerance, we see that in areas where youth drug user are most prevalent, juvenile crime has significantly increased. Furthermore, studies found that drug use in Holland is among the primary motivations for crimes against property. And this is very important to note because it paints a certain image of society, right? An image of criminality, an image of uh, um, uncivil behavior. It paints the image of child neglect, child abuse, broken families, broken homes, and a broken home is broken society. Um, These are all things that Canadians should want to avoid. Canadians shouldn't be interested in. Canadians shouldn't want. And so it is the role of government to ensure that the protection of the protection and the survival of the organism is upheld uh, through this idea of a shared sense of morality, uh, morality against hard drugs, morality against illicit drugs, morality against drug addiction, and the negative effects that drugs can have and do have in society. And this matches the general polling and public opinion. So generally, public opinion is in favor of keeping hard drugs illegal, which has been the case for over a century, right? And for good reason. The fact that it's so internationally accepted for over 100 years now that illicit drugs should be illegal, um, speaks to the negative impacts that drugs can and do show themselves to have on society. But just to give 2 examples, in the United States, polling found that 82% of those polled were against the legalization of heroin and cocaine. Uh, Similarly, in Australia, 95% of those polled were against the legalization of cocaine, heroin, and amphetamines. Uh, and so, to conclude this argument, it's essentially the idea that what does it mean to be Canadian, right? What is the values and the image of Canadian society? Is it a hardworking society of productive people working towards the goal of producing a well-developed, advanced society, technologically, economically, socially, medically, culturally, or is it a society that's painted with the image of criminal violence, painted with the image of sickness, painted with the image of child neglect and child abuse, painted with the image of poor health, poor productivity, poor work ethic, poor community, poor society, right? What do we want to be? We must uphold it. And the laws must reflect what we want to uphold and what we want to be and what we want to be seen as and what we want to create within society. And therefore, um, based on the trends, based on what has been clearly shown to be the result of drug use, the result of hard drugs, uh, the best solution, the only solution is to um, A, take the democratic option, and B, take the morally standing option, which is to ensure that illicit drugs remain illegal. In this argument, we focus on how drugs strain the healthcare system and how the negative health impacts on drug users and drug addicts um, negatively impact society, and therefore illicit drugs should remain illegal. So to build the foundation of this argument, we're going to look at the theory of Mills around the organization of society. So Mills noted that people sacrifice momentary happiness for long-term gain. We're ready to put our momentary happiness aside, knowing that in the future this will be there's a greater gain to be achieved. And an important point to keep in mind is that so long as freedom of speech freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of taste are upheld, then society can tolerate certain deviances so long as we can still be happy. Right? And this comes from the idea that all happinesses are not equal. right? We have momentary happiness and we have long-term happiness, and we prefer long-term happiness because it's more long-lasting. And naturally, with a goal set at a distance, a path is created and society moves together towards the end goal to achieve what they're looking for. Certain deviances can occur on the path. However, Mills argues that people are ready to tolerate certain deviances so long as they don't make us unhappy and so long as they don't cross the three factors necessary for society, which are, as was mentioned, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of taste. And for Mills, in the context of government, the government has the duty to provide security and provisions as well as to look for long-term results. And thus, an important question for us to ask here is, does legalization of illicit drugs generate long-term happiness? And do illicit drugs cause or stop the path towards said happiness? Uh, in the case of illicit drugs stopping the path towards happiness, then there's no doubt or question mark on its legalization in this context. It must remain illegal because it's hindering society at large. So, drugs are very costly, especially on the healthcare system, because they pose such a danger to society and to the individuals who use them, who likely become addicted to them, and so on. If we look at the case of the US and Canada, we see that in the US, the former director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy argued that illicit drugs cost an estimated $180 billion a year, and this is $180 billion in healthcare, in loss of productivity, in crime, and so on. In Canada, in 2022, nearly $40 million in funding was allocated to support those using substances across Canada, and $40 million was allocated across various regions and districts. So it's important here to know that addiction incapacitates its users and keeps them away from functioning to the best of their abilities within society. If society cannot function as it ought to, if society cannot function as it should, if such a heavy strain is put on our healthcare system every year, then surely regulation must be kept in place to ensure that these drugs remain off the streets, out of the hands of the society, for the protection of society. A study in Vancouver, and we'll end this argument here, looked into employment cessation and long-term labor market engagement and HIV infection risk among people who inject drugs in urban Canadian settings. And a few of the results of their studies found that out of 1,222 participants in the study, 50.6% transitioned out of employment at least once directly due to injection of drugs or drugs that they hadn't been injecting. And 26.2% had at least 2 employment exits. Right? And what this indicates is that about half of the participants were citizens moving in and out of employment, who then would fall into illegal wealth generation, such as through the sex work industry or through selling drugs themselves. Many fell out of home and were required housing and ended up on the streets, right? And these transitions out of employment were also largely found to be correlated to the spread of disease such as HIV. And HIV is a very important point here because with these drugs on the streets, with the needle sharing, there's a very large threat posed to society, a very large danger posed to society. And legalization would only open that door much wider, allowing for people to have much easier access to these drugs, much easier access to the sharing of needles, for example, which has a high correlation to HIV and the spread of many other diseases as well. And these diseases then correlate to lower employment, people falling out of housing, to people moving towards illegal methods of generating money for themselves, and just a whole mess, essentially. And so for the security of society, for the achievement of long-term gain, long-term happiness, we need to let go of the short-term happiness that drugs and hard drugs especially are able to offer us, because in the long run, we're being hurt more than we're actually gaining. And so, with that, surely legalization cannot happen. Illicit drugs must remain illegal. And with that, our presentation is brought to an end essentially. In this presentation, we looked at the historical analysis on drug policy, where the historical policy journey of illicit drugs, starting from the Opium Act of 1908 through the Cannabis Act of 2018 till present day. These acts showcase a drastic shift from a criminal justice approach to emphasizing harm reduction and emphasis on public health, focusing on treating the victims of drugs and putting an emphasis on keeping illicit drugs illegal. Our first argument was the discussion looking into or taking a deep dive into the intricate relationship between illegal drugs, the workforce, and the capitalist system. We began by establishing the centrality of labor to capitalism, as noted by Marx, emphasizing that a well-educated and stable workforce is essential for generating surplus value and consequently the health of the economy. We then scrutinized the detrimental effects of illegal drugs on the workforce. Drawing from Canadian studies, we illustrated the direct impact of drug abuse on employment rates and healthcare systems, revealing how drug-related issues led to a significant reduction in available labor and an increase in healthcare costs, which in 2020 alone amounted to substantial losses in Canada. The conversation shifted to the educational sector, where we highlighted the negative correlation between drug use and academic performance. We pointed out that students who abstain from drugs like cannabis achieve notably higher grades than their counterparts who do not. Furthermore, the misuse of prescription stimulants among college students was discussed as a contributing factor to lower academic achievements and an increased propensity for substance abuse. Economically, we explored the concept of GDP and how illegal drugs sap economic vitality by diverting resources from productive investments to the containment of drug-related problems. In the United States, the financial burden of the opioid crisis on the GDP was used as a stark example of the economic toll of drug issues. We also considered here the importance of social reproduction in sustaining a viable workforce. Here, the focus was on future generations with particular attention to the risks posed by prenatal exposure to drugs, which threatens the health and potential of newborns, thereby undermining the quality of the future labor pool. The next argument we looked at, Canadians, not drug addicts, looked at society through the lens of Durkheim, asking ourselves, what type of society do we want as Canadians? Durkheim's notion of organic solidarity, the idea that people are as one organism, each required to put in labor and participate in a shared morality to ensure the survival of the organism. Drugs, hard drugs, illicit drugs take us away from the optimal society we wish to achieve. Drugs being correlated to criminal activity, child abuse, weakened productivity, and more are surely not something that speaks to what it means to be a Canadian, and therefore illicit drugs are surely not something that should be legalized. Our final argument looked at how drugs strain the healthcare system. We looked into just how much societies are paying due to illicit drug use. From billions of dollars spent on healthcare to the rampant spread of disease, illicit drugs do not help us achieve what Mills understood as long-term happiness. Illicit drugs are an obstacle in the achievement of our long-term goals, and thus it is the government's duty to ensure that these obstacles are removed. Illicit drugs should remain illegal.